The First World War did not begin as a single explosion, but as a slow ignition. Europe entered 1914 with confidence polished to a shine so bright it blinded itself. The decades before the war had paraded discoveries, inventions, and ambitious claims about civilization's maturity. Nations boasted about culture, science, order, and unity. They believed they had outgrown catastrophe. Yet beneath the elegance of the age, the long boulevards, the ornate parliaments, the new universities, the orchestras, the laboratories, something trembled. That tremble grew into a rumble, and by August 1914, it became a roar that swallowed borders, oceans, and millions of lives. What followed was not simply war, it was a transformation of humanity. The old world burned, and in its place rose something raw, uncertain, and changed forever. The war rearranged not just territory, but imagination, not just armies, but ordinary existence. This story is not about battles alone. It is about how life itself was rewritten under the weight of a global conflict that no one fully understood until it was too late. The months before the war possessed a kind of serenity that history later reimagined as foreshadowing. Cafes were full, factories were booming, and scholars and statesmen alike spoke of progress, as if it were a law of nature. Technology dazzled. Automobiles hummed through cities, telephones multiplied in offices, motion pictures flickered in darkened rooms. But beneath the veneer of optimism lay deep anxieties. Nations amassed weapons while insisting they desired peace. Alliances promised cooperation while preparing for catastrophe. Newspapers filled with patriotic rhetoric and popular imagination inflated war into a symbol of renewal rather than destruction. When mobilization orders reverberated across Europe, men left their homes believing they were stepping into a brief, heroic adventure. The photographs taken in 1914, smiling faces boarding trains, flowers tucked into rifles, postcards sent with casual bravado, would soon become relics of a world that no longer fit inside them. The last summer ended not with twilight, but with smoke. Once the armies collided, the war revealed its true nature. Not the swift maneuver of cavalry and honor, but the grinding permanence of trenches. The Western Front became a scar drawn across Europe, deep, jagged, and seemingly immune to healing. Life inside the trenches was a form of slow erosion. Mud replaced earth, lice replaced comfort, and artillery replaced silence. The landscape hardened into a geometry of ditches, craters, sandbags, and wire rain turned paths into rivers. Winter turned rifles into iron bars. Summer returned only the stench of bodies too long unburied. Men learned to live with things civilization had never trained them to endure. They slept beside rats, wrote letters under bombardment, ate meals while shells shook the spoons in their hands. They memorized the sound of artillery as if it were language. The whistle of an incoming shell became a punctuation mark in daily life. Trench warfare altered the relationship between humans and the earth. The ground, once a symbol of stability, became unpredictable, collapsing, flooding, exploding without warning. Soldiers dug into the soil, as if burrowing into the ribs of a planet that had turned hostile. The front did not move for months, sometimes years. It existed like a vast, open wound on the continent, refusing to close. The war became not a march, but a residence. While the Western Front stagnated, the Eastern Front heaved across enormous distances. Armies marched through forests, plains, and villages that had not imagined themselves as battlegrounds. The fighting stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, swallowing landscapes that had no time to grieve before being overrun again. Entire populations fled in waves, peasants pushing carts piled with blankets and memories, families carrying icons and livestock in the same exhausted procession. Soldiers often marched side by side with refugees, sharing the same hunger and the same ignorance of what tomorrow might bring. The Eastern Front's shifting lines created a war of instability rather than entrenchment. Towns changed hands repeatedly, each occupation leaving marks. Burned barns, requisitioned grain, footprints of armies from opposite nations stamped onto the same frozen road. In the vastness of the East, the war devoured not only soldiers, but the structures of empire. By 1917, Russia collapsed into revolution. The Tsarist world, with its palaces, rituals, and hierarchies, fell under the weight of hunger, defeat, and disillusionment. What emerged in its place was something new, volatile, and determined to reshape not just Russia, but the century that followed. The war unraveled the old order as efficiently as artillery dismantled fortresses. Though Europe bore the largest share of ruin, the war was global from its first months. In Africa, battles raged across colonies controlled by European powers. Local soldiers fought in uniforms of empires that did not represent them. On land that suddenly mattered only because it belonged to someone far away. Many African porters and troops died not from bullets, but from disease and exhaustion. Their stories scattered by the wind rather than preserved in monuments. In Asia, Indian soldiers fought in France, Mesopotamia, East Africa. They endured cold they had never known, languages they could not decipher, and racial hierarchies built into command structures. In China, tens of thousands of laborers crossed the world to dig trenches, haul ammunition, and repair railways on the Western Front. In the Pacific, Japan seized German colonies and expanded its influence across the region, reshaping Asian geopolitics. The war's reach extended across oceans, weaving together people who had never imagined their fates connected. The trenches of France contained accents and prayers from continents that textbooks of the time scarcely mentioned. The war was global not because it spanned maps, but because it rearranged the meaning of the world. Behind the lines, civilians fought a different battle, one of endurance, deprivation, and emotional turbulence. Rationing became a steady drumbeat of daily life. Meat disappeared from plates. Coal vanished from cellars. Sugar transformed into luxury. Women took over factories, farms, offices, and transportation. In doing so, they altered the social fabric of their nations without waiting for permission. Governments expanded their power dramatically. Censorship tightened its grip. Posters instructed citizens how to think and behave. Propaganda painted the war in colors designed to conceal the mud, blood, and grief. Daily life became a series of negotiations with scarcity and anxiety. Mothers lined up for bread not knowing if their sons still lived. Workers spent long days manufacturing shells that would return as thunder over some distant horizon. Doctors treated influenza and malnutrition with the same exhausted resignation. The home front learned that war did not require proximity to ruin, only proximity to responsibility. The First World War was the first conflict in which machinery earned more fear than generals. Industrialization changed not only how war was fought, but what war meant. The machine gun turned courage into futility, mowing down advances that would have succeeded in any previous century. Artillery became the true ruler of the battlefield, killing invisibly and impersonally. The ground shook not from footsteps, but from mathematics. Tanks emerged like armored animals crawling out of human imagination, heavy and uncertain, but undeniably new. Aircraft turned the sky into an extension of the battlefield, once unreachable, now a place of reconnaissance and threat. Poison gas dissolved the illusion that technology was humanity's companion. Instead, it proved that intelligence could be weaponized against the body itself. War was no longer a contest of kings or traditions. It became a laboratory, cold, methodical, and unashamed in its hunger. The machine, once humanity's servant, had become the protagonist. The human body, that fragile architecture of bone and breath, encountered forces it had never been designed to withstand. Steel shattered limbs, explosions hurled men into the air, chemicals scarred lungs permanently, medical wards filled with injuries that textbooks had never prepared doctors to treat. Surgery advanced out of necessity. Blood transfusions evolved from experiment to routine. Orthopedics developed new techniques for rebuilding shattered limbs, facial reconstruction, pioneered for the war's disfigured survivors, blended science with artistry. But not all wounds were visible. The psychological toll of trench warfare forced the world to confront mental trauma. Shell shock, initially dismissed as cowardice or weakness, became a term representing something more profound: the mind's inability to reconcile constant threat with survival. Men who once spoke with ease became mute. Others trembled uncontrollably or wandered in states of detachment. The war expanded medicine not only into the body, but into the soul. The conflict shattered illusions of invincibility, both national and personal. While the guns thundered, culture did not disappear. It changed shape. Artists at the front sketched ruined landscapes, capturing a world reduced to fragments. Poets described mud and fear with an honesty that previous literature had never dared. The war stripped language of romanticism. Words became blunt instruments. Back home, writers, composers, and painters grappled with a world cracking open. Modernism emerged not from preference, but necessity. The war had fragmented reality. Art responded by fragmenting form. Cinemas filled with newsreels that collapsed distance. People witnessed battles they did not fight, turning war into a public spectacle, and shared anxiety. The conflict reshaped creativity. Hope survived, but not in its old form. The beauty that followed the war often contained splinters of grief. By the war's end, 4 empires lay in pieces: the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, the Ottoman Empire. Borders were redrawn with the swift confidence of cartographers and the blind optimism of diplomats. New nations emerged, some with fragile identities, some with ambitions that would later fracture the century again. The war taught the world that empire had limits, but it also revealed that freedom born from collapse often arrives tangled in uncertainty. When the armistice was signed on November 11, 1918, the guns finally ceased. But the silence that followed was not peace. It was a pause, a breath taken by a world unsure how to begin again. Cities rang bells, waved flags, and embraced in relief. Yet beneath the celebration lay exhaustion and absence. Millions never returned home. Millions of others returned, changed in ways their families could not fully understand. The war had lasted 4 years. Its imprint would last a century. The First World War did more than devastate a generation. It rewired the planet. It reshaped geopolitics. It accelerated technology. It expanded government power. It changed gender roles. It exposed the fragility of civilization. It laid the foundations for revolutions. It planted the seeds of the next global conflict. The war did not end the old world only once. It continued, ending it long after treaties were signed. The world learned that progress was not linear, that invention could betray, that borders could break, and that humanity could be both resilient and reckless beyond measure. When historians speak of the First World War, they speak of millions, millions mobilized, millions wounded, millions dead. But each number hides a life: a shopkeeper, a farmer, a teacher, a son, a sister writing letters. No one would answer. The war took these lives and folded them into something large and impersonal. Yet the story of the war is also the story of small acts of endurance: the soldier warming his hands over a candle, the nurse washing mud from uniforms, the family waiting by the radio, the refugee carrying a child through snow. The war mechanized destruction. People humanized survival. Even a century later, the First World War is not finished. Its lessons remain relevant in the age of technology, nationalism, global networks, and fragile alliances. It revealed that nations can sleepwalk into disaster. It showed that modernity does not prevent brutality. It warned that technology magnifies consequences. It proved that humanity can adapt, even in darkness. And it reminded the world that peace is not absence of war, but presence of responsibility. Civilization must always be tended, like a garden threatened by its own ambitions. Some of the war's landscapes healed. Some never did. Some carry scars visible only when the light hits them just right. A dip in a field, a rusted fragment of shell turned up by a plow, a row of gravestones whose ages remain forever between 18 and 25, yet, from the ruins, the world rebuilt itself. In steel, in treaties, in architecture, in memory. The war consumed the old world's certainty. What remained became humility. The story of the First World War is not merely a narrative of destruction. It is also a story of endurance, the stubborn, quiet persistence of life. People rebuilt homes, nations rebuilt laws, artists rebuilt language, and scientists rebuilt knowledge. Out of the fire emerged a world that trembled, but continued. And perhaps that is the sharpest truth the war offers. Humanity changes, breaks, rebuilds, falters, rises, but it continues, always continues.